This is Brian Kemple of Continuum Philosophical Insight, and I just want to say a few quick words on Neuro Reductionism. This is one particular branch of the tree of Materialist Reductionism. In other words, the view that everything in the universe is what can be empirically observed, perhaps quantified, but at the very least something corporeal, sensible, detectable in the universe somehow or another by senses or by something that can be interpreted through the senses. Neuroreductionism specifically is that branch which treats the personal self as nothing other than the product of the brain. And oftentimes this is put in the terminology of saying that the self is the fiction of the brain. It's something that the brain creates for itself in order to make experience more intelligible. This sometimes also goes by the name of epiphenomenalism, and you'll find it in a number of philosophers and social scientists. Names like Patricia and Paul Churchland come to mind, Daniel Dennett. In short, it's a kind of way of explaining away a lot of our experience without actually explaining any of our experience. And so what I want to do today is to just point out a few quick problems with this theory and show a little bit of what it doesn't do and what we ought to think in response to it. So, first of all, reductionism, materialist reductionism, is generally based on some form or another of empiricism. That is, the theory that all of our knowledge comes through the senses, and that all of our knowledge, in order to say that it's valid knowledge, can be reduced somehow or another to things that we sense. So you'll find this really clearly stated in David Hume's Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, written in the 18th century, where he says, at the end of his treatise that any book which is not useful practically in terms of science, or its claims cannot be reduced to some sort of sense observation, if it contains some sort of abstruse metaphysics or something like that, then it should be committed to the flames. And so while not everyone accepted Hume's opinions at his own time, they continued to be influential for many, many years afterwards and are still influential today. But the important thing to note about empiricism is that it is a knowledge claim, right? It's making a knowledge claim. It's making a claim of knowledge about knowledge. And so it's often been pointed out that these really strict empiricisms, which grew out of the late Renaissance and the Enlightenment, out of the philosophies of John Locke and Hume, and etc., that these are self-defeating theories, right? Because they cannot themselves be proved empirically. And you cannot reduce the veracity of the empirical claim that all knowledge comes from the senses to something empirical. Right? So that's a fairly obvious argument against it. But I think more fundamentally in some sense, and this applies to all the varieties of reductionism that you'll find, is that they're simply incongruous with reality. Part of the impetus for any sort of materialist theory in the first place is a sort of reaction against superstitious beliefs, right? Beliefs in mystical things and in ghosts and spirits and the supernatural and things that we can't see or observe having real effects on our existence. Well, the fact of the matter is there's lots of things that we cannot see or experience with the senses that have a real effect on our existence, and I'll come around to those in a few minutes. But a whole lot of our experience as human beings relies on meaning that cannot be reduced to what is found, strictly speaking, in the senses. And so what we find with the reductionist views, I think, generally speaking, is something very counterintuitive. And Robert Spemann pointed this out very well in his book on persons. They said that materialist monism is counterintuitive because it says that all of our self-understanding is in fact a self-misunderstanding, right? That we experience ourselves as somehow not reducible to the material. That there's something about being a person which can't be explained simply by the bits and the pieces of our sort of mechanical structure. That we have to discount if materialism is true. And so in a sense, all the burden of proof really has to be on the materialist monistic view. Of course, by its very own properties, by its very own claims, it can't give proof for these sorts of things. So I think in contrast, what we have to do, I'm a realist philosopher, and I'm speaking to people who are probably somehow or another realist in the very least, their pragmatic conduct in day-to-day life. I think we need to start with the presupposition that the universe is intelligible. And that's something that Neuro Reductionism denies right off the bat. And I don't want to get too much into the complicated details of why that is, but it should seem fairly obvious on just sort of a quick view of the claims that it makes. That intelligibility of the universe is something that doesn't actually exist, right? It's all just mechanisms moving in different ways, and one of the consequences of those mechanisms is that we have these illusory explanations for ourselves of why things appear to us in the way that they do. But starting with the presupposition that the universe is intelligible, there's good reasons to start with that presupposition. It's not saying that it's a certainty, that we simply take it for granted for all time that the universe is intelligible, but it's an apparent truth, right? Just based on our day-to-day interactions with the world around us, that, we do understand things around us, and we can understand how they work, and what they are, and what they do, and so on and so forth. So, ultimately what we want to do as human beings, as knowers, is to, find this intelligibility through something systematic, right? Something which is a coherent whole, which explains how all the parts fit together and why they fit together the way they do. What the principles are of this intelligibility. And I think we can do that. That's what I've tried to do a little bit to get people started to see that in the Introduction to Philosophical Principles book that I published on Amazon. That this presupposed intelligibility is something which can be confirmed through our experience. So really, we experience things that drive us to ask questions, right? And we experience things in life that make us go, okay, well, how does this work? Why does this work the way that it works? And I think what you'll find when you really think about the neuroreductionist position is that it can't really answer any questions, right? There's no question of meaning that could be answered in a way which is itself meaningful if you take the neuroreductionist view as true. In other words, if we're just our brains, or if the fact, or excuse me, not the fact, if the idea that we are a self, that each one of us is a self, is just a fiction that the brain produces, then anything you attribute to that self is likewise a fiction, right? And so you end up in this sort of infinite regress of fictitious explanations. Things are explained by fictions. And so, what you end up with is that you're nothing more sophisticated or complicated than, say, the chemical signals which are bouncing around in the brain, which is, as previously stated, very counterintuitive, but also means that any knowledge claim that you have is itself epiphenomenal, right? It's something which is covered over simply a mechanism of your brain. Right, so there is no meaning left at all in the universe when you start with the neuroreductionist position. So, in contrast to this, our experience as human beings, our experience is one that is of meaning. Right? everything we experience in some way or another can be construed as meaningful, sometimes incorrectly, but there's always some sort of meaning potential there in all of our experiences. And this meaning potential always outpaces, extends beyond the boundaries of what can be empirically verified. So, in other words, we start with the senses. It's true that all of our knowledge begins in sensation, but sensation is simply a passive reception. We as human beings don't just sense, right? In fact, what we think of as sensation usually is actually something much more like perception. That is, we can sense things that we don't perceive, but they're things of which we're not conscious, right? If you think about it right now, there's all sorts of things that are acting on your sensory faculties, right? The chair that you're sitting in, or the floor that you're standing on, the clothes that you're wearing. There's probably some background noise that you're not aware of. There's things in your field of vision, possibly odors. There's all sorts of things which are impacting your sensory faculties, but that you're not aware of, right? Because you're not perceiving them. And when I draw your attention to them, like the clothes that you're wearing, or things that are at the corners of your eyes, then you perceive them, right? And you become conscious of them, and you're aware of them as objects that have been sensed. And when we move to perception of things, right, we find meanings which cannot be explained by the physical properties themselves. So, for instance, when we find something dangerous or frightening or attractive to us, right, there might be some basis for that interpretation in the thing itself, but there's nothing about, say, a dog in and of itself which is frightening, which is why some dogs can be frightening and other dogs can be not frightening. Even dogs that are acting in an aggressive manner, if you know the dog well, if you have perceived that dog regularly and have a habit of interpreting the meaning of that dog's actions, you will not be frightened by it, right? Okay. And so it's this sort of grasp of meaning which is always beyond sensation, right? It's tied to sensation, it relies upon sensation, but it can't be explained by the sensible things themselves. And that extends even further when we come to the sort of uniquely human capacity of intellection, right? That we're able to grasp meanings which aren't just in sort of that evaluative, like, is this good for me, is this bad for me, is this attractive, is this repulsive, but to ask what things actually are themselves. What is the being of this object? What does this thing mean in and of itself, irrespective of how it is related to myself? So yeah, that's just a few things which I think point out some of the problems with this neuroreductive, short-sightedness, which has sort of seeped its way into a lot of thinking today. And I hope this is maybe helpful for some people, or will at least get a conversation going with, I don't know, Bo Weingard maybe, about what the problems are with this view and why this view is not really a well thought out one. There's some very amazing, interesting, compelling evidence about what the brain does and what the brain can do and why the brain is necessary for human experience. But to reduce that experience to the brain is to take reality and try and compress all of it into a tiny little fraction. And it just doesn't hold up. The theory doesn't have the strength to compress human experience that way. There's so much that we experience, like relations, right? Find me a relation in physical reality. You can't. You can show me things which are related, and you can talk about how they're related, but relation itself doesn't, obey the laws of time and space, which is pretty fascinating when we start to think about what relation really is. So anyway, I'm going to wrap this up now. I hope it was helpful for anyone who's listened, and thanks for your time.